Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nimdzi's Live, where we're going to be discussing the Nimdzi 100, at least the preliminary findings that myself and the research team have collected. And we know that there are plenty of you coming from all over the globe. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you are in. And today I'm joined here by Marjolein and Renato. You don't need introductions to Renato. Probably is one of the most known figures in the industry, and my boss and friend. And Marjolein joined Nimdzi last year. Welcome back to the fold, Marla, having spent so many years at Multilingual.
Thank you.
And she's been instrumental in bringing the research together, doing a lot of the heavy lifting and footwork. An amazing colleague to have on the team. I'm very happy to be collaborating with you. But let's dive right in. We have half an hour and a lot of findings to talk about, even though this is just preliminary. And I'm sure that when we release the final Nimdzi 100 State of the Industry and Ranking, we will have a longer chat, probably also here on LinkedIn. The report itself is out, and we highlight some key trends and notions about the industry. The state of the industry as such, we'll be detailing some of that here. At this webinar, we will be discussing figures and we'll be looking at some background information as well that we may have in our pockets, each of us. Importantly, go and visit the report itself. All the data is there. And we just released it today, and we're very proud of it. And let's dive right into the slides. Tucker in the background operating the machines. Thank you, dear sir. Here we go. Something that will probably surprise you or not is that the industry is growing, which is amazing for everybody who's within the language industry. Even though you might notice that the growth is slower than we originally projected. Last year, we said that the industry will keep growing at 7%. We down-tuned that to about 5% growth, or a more linear curve even for the near future. But last year, the industry grew faster than the year before. We have no doubts about that. Reports that were created from the survey indicate that basically growth across the different segments of the industry is stronger than last year, even though, of course, not all the boats are lifted. There are plenty of ups and lots of downs, but overall, on an aggregate level, there are positive signs for the industry, despite uncertainties and confusion and AI and all that. And Renato, I would love to invite you to speak about some of the factors that are behind the growth, maybe restrained growth, but there are plenty of things that need to be highlighted there. Take it away.
So naturally, what we're measuring here is revenue, right? So we're talking about growth in revenue. But one of the things that it's clear is that there was a significant amount of growth in volume. And that there's no doubt that there was more translation that was done last year in 2024 than it was in 2023. What are the dynamics that affect the final revenue of the company? Those are things that we are analyzing more in depth and are going to appear in the final report that we have. But some preliminary findings indicate that some areas like interpretation, for example, have grown a lot more than traditional translation. Another factor that seems interesting is that even though volume has grown maybe in double digits, the pricing, there has been a lot of pressure in pricing. So margins, the profit, the profitability, and the revenue have grown at single digits. Hence, we have a aggregate growth of the industry at around 5.5%, 5.6%, instead of this big numbers, double-digit numbers that we see for some companies. Another indicator that is interesting for us to see is that there has been some consolidation, some significant amount of M&A happened this year in the industry. And when we look at the numbers and the rankings themselves, we're going to see that we have, for the first time, $2 billion companies in the ranking, LanguageLine and TransPerfect first, and LanguageLine in second place. And we have 6 companies above $500 million in revenue. So we're talking about big numbers. And these are companies that have stayed stable or grown in 2024. And this is the thing. You can see a $3 million company that shrank by 10%. They lost $300,000, but a $1 billion company that grew by I don't know 1% or 5%. The numbers are, the scale is very different, right? So I think that the narrative that we heard a lot in 2024, when you talk to individual participants, individual companies, especially the smaller companies, and you're going to show the breakdown of this growth, we see a lot of fear and despair because there is a reduction in business. But for the industry as a whole, which is what we're measuring here with the Nimdzi 100, we have growth, which is encouraging. Back to you, Lazslo.
Thank you. And as I said, we kind of corrected our projections for a more linear growth than previously. We said it's going to be 7% CAGR, compound annual growth rate, which is exponential. Now we rather believe that, especially in the next 2-3 years, is going to be more on the linear side. And there are lots of economic and geopolitical factors which contribute to that projection. Just mentioning a few of them, would that be Germany's economy is in trouble, Europe with high energy prices, in the US, the new presidential regime and everything with it. Already we know that many of the international aid funds have been cut, and these are already impacting translation and localization initiatives in different regions of the world, would that be Africa or Southeast Asia. There's a lot of fear, of course, in the public sector in the US that may impact even interpretation businesses. But generally,
we've heard from companies that have lost 100% of their business, 30% of their business, 15% of their business, depending on their exposure to federal contracts, right? Because this constraint with the presidential mandate to essentially eliminate foreign aid and projects that involved a lot of translation affect only federal contracts, and they have impacts, ripple effects around the world. But anyway, we don't know how long this is going to take, if it is permanent or not, and if it is going to be replaced by, we already hear that the UK and France and the Netherlands are taking on some of the projects that were abandoned by USAID and so on. But anyway, keep going.
That's 100% right. And in addition, let's not forget the kind of looming tariff wars that many major magazines and newspapers, they write about. If those come to happen, then much of the international trade may be impacted, which sometimes is bad for the industry. We believe it's often good because, new contracts need to be signed. New kinds of communication is arising.
Crises are usually very good for the language industry.
Quite right. And we have observed this in the past, and we don't believe that it's going to be hugely impactful for industry in the negative way. But we do believe the more constrained growth for the projection is advised. And if we need to correct upwards next year, we'll be all the happier. That said, also last year, we released the language industry curve concept. And Renato, this was by and large your child as well. I would love you to talk through that in a couple of minutes. Why we believe that the industry keeps growing, and what are the key underlying technology factors that we think when we created this?
Well, very basically is that this is an industry that more technology breeds more automation, breeds more content breeds more translation breeds growth, more volume. And we have seen this pattern before, and we show it there which is an article that is available on our website, freely available, and where we describe the history of the language industry and how it has grown at every new technology adoption that we have had. And one of the things that we, just to highlight and briefly, that we tend to forget is that whenever there is a change in the technology landscape, there are many companies that are created, new players that come into the market, and these new players need translation and localization. I think I find it a paradox that we used to have. We used to say, well, Google has Google Translate, but it's still one of the biggest buyers of localization in the world. Now, OpenAI, which many people saw as a threat for the localization industry, has a localization manager and has a localization department. So they themselves use localization. So we still believe that based on the dynamics of the localization industry, there is plenty of room for growth in the next 10 years.
Certainly agreeing with that. Another thing that we have noticed along the years is every time a new technology paradigm is introduced, there's also a new layer of complexity when it comes to implementing these into localization workflows, or even interpreting workflows for that matter. Every kind of multilingual communication, especially in the low risk tolerance segment, very careful vetting and empirical testing needs to be introduced before being able to deploy. And this is exactly what we've seen with AI now, close to 2.5 years of ChatGPT. And even though there are some success stories with it, the transformational shift that has been predicted by so many has still not happened. And we know that with machine translation, when neural machine translation was introduced, it took 4, 5, 6 years to become mainstream in the industry, and it only helped the industry to grow. And it's pretty much the same with large language models in the new wave of AI as well, despite the fact that the promise that AI can do so many different things, so many use cases can be solved, but it's rather an attempt to solve new problems that was bringing the growth to the industry. No doubt about this. Solution architecture, solving individual client problems, is a much more lucrative and interesting aspect of language service providers' offerings than doing vanilla translation work, which is, in fact, as we know it, is in a sense reducing in overall value, i.e. in revenue, even though it's growing in volume.
Yeah.
An important thing is that technology very often, or over time, has been reducing the per unit costs, say the per word translation costs. It's one of those challenges which is has been seen by many as assumed technology progress or productivity increases challenge freelancers, challenge smaller language service providers, whereas the bigger ones who are capable of maintaining pace with the technology progress, they harvest the benefits. And this is actually seen also in the growth numbers in many ways. And Marjolein, I would love you to speak about how the top 100 at least is structured and how the growth has been distributed across these different segments of the top 100. What would be the key factors behind those?
Sure thing. Well, like you hinted earlier, M&A has been a very important factor for where you can see a concentration of growth in the top 100. The top 50 are seeing the greatest growth, and then the bottom 50, so 51 to 100, they're not doing as strongly. They're not as strong as the top 50. The top 6 there, those are all companies that reported revenues of over $500 million US. After that, very interestingly, you have a segment that ends at 200 million, right at the number 20, and then another segment that ends at 100 million at ranking number 29. After that, between that and the number 100, which is at 18.3 million, there is a really long tail, a really slow difference, a small difference between companies. So much so that there are 30 companies that are running between 25 and 35 US million. So there is a lot of potential to move around in that category. Other than that, overall market, the overall market cut of the top 100 out of the industry, it's a little bit smaller actually than last year. So it's an interesting trend but M&A, back to M&A, it is a really big factor. So in the top 100, you saw 4 companies that have steadily positioned themselves in the top 100, getting taken up by other companies. Of course, Acorbi and ULG were brought into the fold of Propio. Eva was bought up by Visual Data Media, and Yonkers went in with Aclaro. So that leaves more room for the mid-market segment to kind of move up into the top 100. And then I also want to touch on a thing that Renato said. So even when revenues have been going down for some LSPs, they are reporting very often an increase in profit margin, which means there's more capital to work with, right? So I would feel pretty confident to project that that capital can then be used to consolidate that mid-market segment into more larger companies. So I wouldn't be surprised at all that if next year we see the top 100 take a larger share of the pie, and then out of that to see the top 10 take a larger share out of the top 100 pie.
Right. Thank you. And then let's quickly mention on that chart that there are 2 major changes in the top 6 that we highlighted there. I would first come with number 10, which is not here, which is Propio, the acquisitions that Marla just mentioned, plus organic growth, put them onto the top 10, which is amazing. At the same time, let's quickly know that LanguageLine, for the second time in history, has crossed, as the second company in history, has crossed the $1 billion revenue mark. Amazing feat. And Keywords, in our estimations, overtook RWS for the 3rd spot on the ranking. So we have a new troika on the top, and we'll see how it's going to evolve over next year. Next,
and outside of the, I'm sorry, but outside of the strength that you see in AI driven language solution companies, you also see growth in certain verticals that are not necessarily AI based, dubbing, subbing, multimedia, interpretation, definitely medical interpretation. So companies that focus on those verticals, they also tend to do very well. And interestingly, those are specifically the types of services that do not rely on AI. So I think that's definitely worth putting an asterisk on.
Fair enough. Thank you. And then next, we wanted to highlight on the next slide a few insights to say about the 100th LSP, which, Marla, I think you already mentioned. It's last year there was a huge jump from 40 million to 17.8. This year, the 100th LSP on our preliminary ranking, it may stay slightly change, but it's 18.2 million, which again is a step up, which is to say, no, the industry is not shrinking. There are plenty of contenders that want to make it onto the top ranks. Last but not least, when it comes to data, we wanted to talk about the growth rates and why we are confident in our projection that, or actually not projection, in our estimation that the market grew faster than in the previous year. And the next slide says this fairly clearly. Essentially, the entire top 100 grew faster this year than, or sorry, in 2024 than in 23. And it's also true for overall the top 50 and the top 51 to 100. The top 10 and the top 20, they still grew. There's no loss of revenue overall or on an aggregate level. The growth may have been slower a little bit. That said, one of the pictures that comes through is the top 51 and top 100, they observe a lot slower growth than ones who are closer to the top. And that's attributable to various factors. One of them is that many of those companies are traditional founder-owned LSPs, and they have a lot less room to navigate the new landscape, especially paved by AI, to keep up with technology advancements. And on their own, it might be really challenging to find a new formula for growth, or to find new leadership that may navigate through the challenging times. That said, as we mentioned, we believe that in the next few years, AI will help to reduce per unit prices to a level where elasticity will kick in demand, which is to say, demand will grow, volumes of translatables will grow so fast that the overall revenue will start growing faster than previously seen, which is to say, right now we say that the industry will grow around 5% in the next few years. We're looking forward to seeing that actually going up instead of going down, for that record.
Yeah.
Next, I think it's fairly important to mention, Renato.
I was going to say that what you're mentioning is that the complexity of the services is going to increase. And with the complexity increasing, it allows us to process more volume and generates this accelerated growth that we're talking about. I'm
That's
just
right.
confirming what you just said.
Thank you. And then something very important to mention is it seems like most of the segments are growing, or all the segments of the industry are growing. But of course, not everybody is growing the same way. There are many companies who actually sank on the ranking. And if you go on our web and look up the preliminary ranking, then you will see the little indicators, which companies stepped up in the ranks and which are the ones that lost their positions from last year. Very importantly, what that indicates is that the future is not linear, and it's actually even multi-speed. The future is here, and everybody sees that there's a way to move forward, especially with AI, with combining offerings across services, cross-selling, upselling, and various techniques. But the vast majority of the players in the industry, just as on the freeway, would be in the rightmost lane, or maybe the second one. But the reality is that the democratization of technology enables companies, both on buyer and provider side, to jump directly into the inside lane and take the fastest speed possible, with all the risks that come with that as well.
And I like this metaphor, actually, because you can just move into the next lane and then catch up to speed if it's not very busy. But if you have lots of cars and you want to jump into the next lane and it's full, you have to get up to that speed first and then move in with everyone else who's already moving at that pace.
Fun fact, that image that was selected for this one, I would love to say that I took that picture, but I didn't. It actually is very close to Renato's home in Seattle. So when he saw this, he said, "Hey, that's my exit."
That's my exit. It is. But I'd like to add a comment here, because I'm sure there are some of the people listening to this presentation and they're saying, well, but this is not my reality. This is not what I see. My company is shrinking. My company. I'd like to illustrate this because of the effects. One of the characteristics of our industry is this nesting of services. You have the large multi-language vendors that subcontract into medium regional vendors that subcontract into single language vendors that subcontract into translators, right? So what the effect of technology is happening, and we're going to see this in the rankings, is that when a large vendor finds efficiencies in a process, it subcontracts less. So you're going to see contraction in the smaller vendors because the big vendors are not subcontracting as much. And you're going to continue to see more growth in the bigger ones, right? But also when a big client loses a contract, let's say a $5 million contract that he loses, there are 50 vendors that lose $100,000 in revenue. But there's another company that wins that same contract for $4 million. And there are 50 LSPs, other LSPs that get $80,000 in revenue. The net loss was just $1 million in the industry. But it sounds like so many people, 50 companies lost $100,000 in revenue, but we don't talk about the 40 companies that got the $80,000 in revenue more. And that's additional revenue for those 50 other companies. So we need to understand that the losses are not necessarily 100% losses for the industry as a whole. These numbers get juggled around and turn out at the end to what we have identified is a net positive for the industry growing still. And still, I think, Lazlo, and you have the better number of maybe Marjolein, a third of the companies that reported their numbers had decreased revenues, right? Is that correct?
Even more.
Even more, right? So it's not, the growth is not evenly spread.
Not-
We can talk a little bit more about that. Not everybody's growing. There is growth, but it's concentrated. There are some companies that are growing double digits. There are companies that grew 150%. There are companies that grew 39%. And there are companies that lost all of their business. The case of the company that worked for USAID. There are companies that lost 5%, 3%, 8%, all numbers in there in the average.
Yeah, and I would like to say that even when revenues are stagnant or go down, and I see a lot of concern in the comments about this, like freelancers, small LSP, etc. We received more input from that market segment than before. We didn't have a low end of who could join the survey, and even with revenue stagnation or revenue decrease, productivity per person across the board is up way more than you would think when you see the revenues. So that profit margin going up for those that can apply technology effectively, and revenue isn't everything. It's such an important thing to keep in mind. That is not the only factor driving the health of the industry.
Quite right. And one more thing to add to that quickly is that the productivity gain in many ways, and also the increase in profitability, is not only thanks to technology, but very often it is thanks to a shifting priority on the buyer side, which is at once thankful and also a negative impact, because the redefinition of what's good enough can be really positive as long as it relates to how users perceive the content and what the content is able to do, the real value of multilingual communication. Whereas if good enough is phrased as, oh, whatever ChatGPT throws at me is good enough, that requires a significant re-education of the stakeholders, especially because most people who use tools, would that be, again, ChatGPT or DeepL, they don't have the ways and means to assess whether what they got out of the machine is really good enough, because they don't speak the target language. And so that level of education, or giving the indication whether the content has a risk that is acceptable or not, tolerable or not, is a really important factor, and something that service providers and technology providers need to get much better at. Instead of talking about linguistic differences and linguistic quality, you need to talk about what is the risk appetite, the risk level that can be taken or must be faced and mitigated upfront.
Yeah, and there is a great need for MTP, right? The post-editing after machine translation, after anything that went through an AI tool. So linguists might feel stressed out, and I think in some cases an adaptation of skills is the right way to go forward. But the volume part, I do want to cover that as well. As with this new wave of AI, the volumes can go up, right? And that will start a new, I think, series of growth in the future. So I think we might get back to seeing that exponential growth as soon as the market is ready to increase volumes. And Lazslo, you said something really great about that with elasticity.
Yes, and that's very connected to the point that you just made, which is at some point of time, say the per unit prices or per project prices, if you will, through post-edited or validated machine output will be low enough so that buyers will think, it's actually really worth it for me to put that little bit of extra money into it and buy the service on top of the simple technology output. In reality, though, to make that happen, that interaction needs to be close to instantaneous, without waiting and without waste, where the customer needs to say, this is really taking me hours or even days, whereas the machine gave it to me immediately. If it can happen within minutes or hours, in a predictable time, that's a winning formula for any language service provider right now. Just being very aware of the time. I think that we still have 2 more slides, but we can skip over that and we can discuss that at the longer session when the full Nimdzi 100 comes out. I would like to thank everybody's attention today at this webinar where we discussed the preliminary findings from the industry from our research for the Nimdzi 100. The outlook is more positive than we actually thought originally before we started the survey, despite many negative voices. And we're looking forward to bringing you the full insights from the research while we're analyzing still the hordes of data from the surveys and the discussions and interviews. And we'll be back with Marjolein and with Renato for another session with a deeper explanation of many of the factors and details of our findings.
Very good. Thank you, Lazslo.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you.